Today we're going to be talking about the urinary system, and the main organ of the urinary system, of course, will be the kidney. The kidney is going to ultimately be the filtering system for the blood that courses through our body. The kidneys are going to rid this blood that gives life-giving oxygen, picks up the waste materials, carbon dioxide, but other wastes as well, like creatinine, urea. It's also going to maintain our water balance. And so the kidneys are going to get about 25% of our cardiac output on a minute by minute basis. And that's going to really give the kidneys quite a job to do to continually filter the blood so the impurities are removed and we have fresh, clean blood that goes throughout our body, delivering oxygen, picking up carbon dioxide. And this is going to be really important too in maintaining our sodium concentration, our potassium concentration, and our water volume. If a human body were to be broken down, the human body is almost 70% water. And so being almost 70% water means that maintaining homeostasis, that stable, relatively unchanging environment, is of utmost importance. And so maintaining water balance is going to be high priority. If a person had a high blood pressure, probably the first medication that a physician would prescribe for the patient would be a diuretic, a water pill to make them diurese or go to the restroom more often, ridding the body of extra body water. And since blood is composed of plasma and the formed elements, and plasma is mainly composed of water, about 90% of plasma is water, if the patient gets rid of extra body water, then automatically blood volume goes down and blood pressure drops accordingly. So again, the kidneys play a key role in maintaining this water balance and also, like I said before, filtering the blood. Well, the kidneys are going to be located along the back part of the spinal column, and I'm going to remove some of these other vital organs from this static model. And we can see that the kidneys are located along the vertebral column towards the back. Okay, they are protected to some extent by rib pairs 11 and 12 that are known as the floating ribs. But here we can see the kidneys. And the kidneys are fed and read by the renal artery. And then once the blood is cleaned, the blood that leaves the renal artery goes through the kidney under high pressure and is cleaned, returns to the circulation through the renal vein. Now, the kidney is made up of thousands upon thousands of tiny microscopic units called nephrons. Each one of these kidneys is fed by a renal arteriole that branches off of the renal artery, and the renal arterioles are going to filter the blood through a unit called the nephron. And the nephron is going to be important because it's going to filter waste materials, again, creatinine, urea, things along those lines. And so it's going to filter out the waste material and ultimately make sure that when blood returns via the renal vein to the circulation, that the blood is free of impurities. Now, once the blood has entered the kidney from the renal artery and it branches off of the descending aorta, this is the descending aorta that carries blood to the areas below the heart. But once that blood enters the kidney, it's going to take blood from the renal artery, a branch off of the descending aorta. The renal artery will branch into the renal arterioles, and those renal arterioles will branch into renal arterial capillaries, which feed the nephron, the individual filtering unit. And what happens is at the level of the nephron, okay, we're going to see that anything that the body might potentially want to keep filters into a part of the basement membrane of the nephron called the Bowman's capsule. And then it goes through a series of tubules called the the proximal and the distal convoluted tubules, until ultimately anything that we want to get rid of filters into these sections of the kidney called the renal pelvis. And ultimately from the renal pelvis, urine, that we can now call it once it's in the renal pelvis, is going to go down the ureter and then ultimately into the renal bladder. So the bladder is where we will store urine until it's appropriate for us to get rid of that urine, to void, or you may also hear the term micturition. Okay, all of those are terms associated with the body ridding itself of urine. Urine will leave the body through a tube called the urethra. It only will leave when there is a relaxation of sphincters, circular muscular structures, which allow the urine to leave the body, again, when it's appropriate. But the main thing is that at that period of time, the body can consciously control when it relaxes those sphincters and allow the urine to leave the body. Now, to go over some of those high points again, the descending aorta will have a branch called the renal artery. Okay, there would be a right renal artery and a left renal artery. And ultimately, that renal artery goes into the kidney. At the level of the kidney, the renal artery will branch to renal arterioles, and the renal arteriole is going to branch even more into renal arterial capillaries. Well, those renal arterial capillaries are going to feed a structure called the nephron. And the nephron, when that renal arteriole feeds the nephron, we refer to that as an efferent arteriole. And when it leaves, it's going to be referred to as an afferent arteriole. But that renal arteriole will pass through a tuft of capillaries called the glomerulus, and that glomerulus does the job of filtering in the nephron. Anything that doesn't need to be returned to the circulation, in other words, anything that isn't blood, ultimately pools down in the basement membrane, what's known as Bowman's capsule. That will go through a series of tubules called the proximal tubules, and the distal tubules. Ultimately, this area right here, everything below this, we refer to as, the loop of Henle. And the loop of Henle is going to be where we get the term associated with certain types of diuretics called loop diuretics. Loop diuretics are going to make the loop of Henle release water and ultimately not hold on to the water that we normally would hold on to under resting normal conditions. We expel it this way so our body gets rid of extra water in our system, and again that decreases plasma volume, leading to a lower blood pressure. Well, by the time the fluid gets to this this structure called the collecting duct, it's then going to filter into what's known as the renal pelvis. The renal calyces ultimately converge into minor calyces and then major calyces and then finally the renal pelvis. And this renal pelvis will converge into the ureter, which carries what we now can refer to as urine to the bladder. So the bladder fills with the urine, and the bladder is a muscular, smooth muscle ball that can store urine for an extended period of time before it contracts, pushing out the urine through relaxed sphincters in the urethra. And again, the urethra is the tube that leads from the bladder to the outside of the body. So this is an overview of the kidneys. Again, the kidneys are going to be located just below rib pair 11 and 12, where those floating ribs are located. They're towards our lumbar region. Okay, they're up against the back of the spinal column. Okay, they are going to be bean-shaped. Okay, they are composed of thousands and thousands of microscopic filtering units called nephrons. Each kidney gets fed by a branch off of the descending aorta called the left and right renal artery. The renal arteries are going to split into renal arterioles, and then renal arterial capillaries will feed each of the tiny nephron, and the tiny nephrons will filter the blood that ultimately has been filtered will return to the circulation, going out to the renal veins in roughly the same area that it came in. Okay. Through the structure here in blue, the renal veins. And then ultimately the renal veins will have that blood return through the inferior vena cava to the right atrium, and that will now start to recirculate clean blood throughout the cardiovascular system. But anything that makes its way into the bottom of the nephron, okay, in that area of Bowman's capsule, that fluid that's now called filtrate, it's not yet urine, will go through a series of tubules, the proximal convoluted tubules, then the loop of Henle. Anything that the body needs to hold on at the time can be conserved at that point. Anything that it needs to get rid of, excessive amounts of sodium, excessive amounts of potassium, excessive amounts of water, can ultimately be discarded by allowing it to go through the distal convoluted tubule and then out through the collecting duct to the minor and major calyces, which converge into the renal pelvis. The renal pelvis is what ultimately, this is the renal pelvis here on a kidney that's fully, hasn't been dissected, but here the renal pelvis is where we see these little pink finger-like structures, the calyces, converge into this one tube. That's the renal pelvis at that point. It converges into the ureter, and then the ureter carries the urine to the muscular bladder. And then it will be expelled at an appropriate time from the body. Okay, so this is an overview of the urinary system.